As a kid, I lived with my grandparents for a while. And let me tell you, my grandfather was not a friendly guy. He was a World War II vet who then enlisted in the Air Force after returning from the Pacific. He didn't even come home to visit his family for several years. The family lore goes that the war had messed him up in the head, or that he was injured badly, and that he needed time to heal back to himself before coming home. He may have healed, but he never returned back to himself. He was always saying things that the end of the world was right around the corner with all the recent wars in the Middle East, the gasoline rationing, Watergate, the Kennedys, etc., etc. He didn't trust anyone, and he was sure that the banks were going to fail, that the Russians were going to invade, that race riots were coming again. His theories changed literally every week. He always warned me that they would be trying to come and get our stuff someday soon, so we had to be ready. We had shelves of food, water generators, fuel, gold bars, buried firearms, and ammo. You know, the usual. I was 9 or 10 at the time, and this would have been around 1972 or 73. We were living in a small cabin on a ridge looking over the Maumee River in northeast Ohio for the summer. This was his weekend getaway primarily. There were very few neighbors for miles, and the ones that were nearby were mostly weekenders. The nearest small town was about 10 miles away, and the hospitals were even further away. If I recall, there was a 2-lane highway that's on the opposite side of the cabin with nice views of the river. That was pretty much a straight road with slow curves every 10 miles or so. About half a mile down the road, though, there was a crazy sharp curve that terminated in a small bridge over a creek. There were several accidents there every year, and some with fatal injuries. We could often hear the crashes. Sometimes, I would wander down there the next morning to look at the scene and stuff, and wonder if the drivers were doing okay. One warm summer night, we were awakened by a pounding on the front door. My room was right next to the door, and my grandfather was down the hallway a bit. I remember getting out of bed and having him hand me a shotgun. Well, he held a 1911 as he looked through the window to see who it was. I had never recalled anyone ever stopping by before, especially in the middle of the night. The cabin was elevated with a storm shelter underneath, so there were 4 steps leading up to the door. And we had one of those yellow old security lights in the yard, and things always look kind of hazy and weird at night because of them. I looked out the window next to him and saw a man and a woman on the lower step of the door. They must have knocked and then stepped back down to appear less threatening. It was a good call, because he opened the door a bit while openly displaying and keeping his pistol pointed at them. The woman exploded in a crying, blabbering, screaming wail all at once. She said that there was a terrible accident that had just happened down at the curve, and can we please call an ambulance? She said that there were other people who were seriously hurt, and they needed help and asked if we would come to help them too. Now, this man hated hippies more than anyone else, and these two might just have qualified. She had on ripped jeans, one of those suede leather fringed jackets, and the guy looked like he had a biker vest on. She did have what looked like blood in her hair and was not making much sense at all. What was really weird was the guy wasn't saying anything. He was just standing off the porch listening to her go off. I assumed that he was intimidated by the .45 pointed at him and didn't want to antagonize the old man with a crew cut holding it. My grandfather was sure that they were stoned and kept telling the girl to calm down, but she wouldn't, and they got into a screaming match between them, ending with him telling her to get the hell off of his property or he would shoot them both. We were both outside, watching them head back to the road, and I noticed the guy wasn't even wearing any shoes. As I didn't hear a crash, and they were so weird, I didn't know what to think. We went back inside, and my grandfather sat me down and explained his theory to me. They were making the story up. They were most likely drug addicts who were looking for some poor suckers to rob or maybe kill. Unfortunately, it was not that crazy of a theory, as, at the time, the Manson family murders had just happened less than 4 years ago. I recall the Manson story held my grandfather's interest for quite some time. I asked him, what about the blood in her hair? And he stated that it was fake, trying to gain our trust and entrance into our cabin. I thought we could just call the state police to be safe, but he wasn't fond of inviting cops into his world either. So, we just went back to bed. As soon as I woke up, I was still curious, but didn't want to walk down to the bridge on the curb this time. Later in the morning, several police cars and pickups began arriving and parking off to the side of the road down there. And I couldn't resist going down to check it out. My grandmother went with me, as my grandfather was still at work, and an ambulance was departing as we arrived at the location. When we soon saw the evidence of an accident the previous evening, there was a smashed guardrail, bits of metal glass, and a tree off the road with a deep gouge, and a bunch of bark missing. A mangled motorcycle was down in the ditch, and several people were searching around in the heavily wooded creek area. We overheard that there was at least one man dead, and his girlfriend was found a half-mile down the road in really bad shape, and was in critical condition after being found by a passing motorist. It was a single motorcycle that had lost control as far as I understood. One woman was sobbing to one of the troopers, asking if they had found the boots yet. Turns out, her son was the motorcyclist who'd wrecked, and I guess the impact threw him out of the new boots that she said that he had just purchased. She also said that he didn't ever wear a helmet, and she wished that he would. The cop tried to console her and told her that he didn't suffer, as he was most assuredly killed instantly when he hit the tree. I tell you, I think my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. And I have never felt so cold in my life when I started connecting the dots. We walked back home without giving any of the people there any information. I don't remember even speaking to any of them, but I was in a daze. I was freaked out for days. I didn't want to connect the dots anymore, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who did that girl want us to help? I heard my grandparents discussing it only once later that night and coming up with a story to help them sleep at night. They decided that the guy wasn't killed in the crash, that he had somehow died later on, most likely from all the drugs that he and his girlfriend were hopped up on, and that the girl was just fine. We never mentioned it again, but we didn't spend as much time there at that vacation area anymore.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. My 20th birthday was definitely one to remember. Firstly, it was the first birthday I celebrated with a night on the town. From May 18th and 19th, me and my mates were all too broke to drop any serious cash anywhere, so we contented ourselves by getting sloshed in the park or in one of our bedrooms. By the time I hit 20, we could actually afford a proper night out. Needless to say, it was one of the best nights of my life. I was always a bit nervous about clubbing. We hear some horror stories about people getting spiked or glassed and roughed up by bouncers. But we ended up having a great night, a relatively tame one, I'm sure, but it was still one of the best nights of my life, right up until it turned into one of the worst. Turns out we had such a good time that none of us remembered to keep any taxi fare in reserve. So when the time came for the club lights to come on and the bouncers started kicking people out, we realized that if we wanted to go home, we were walking. It wasn't all that far, but given how drunk we were, an hour's walk would be more like an hour and a half, maybe 2. So we set off, causing chaos as we walked down the center of dead streets, stealing traffic cones as we went. There were 5 of us when we started the walk, but gradually we were hitting people's houses on our route, and the group got smaller and smaller until it was just me and my friend Chris. As I said, I know this was stupid, but since it was like 4:30 in the morning and the roads were all but deserted, we were just stumbling around down the middle of the road, which was why I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised when we're blinded by some car's headlights as it came speeding around the corner at us. We tried our best to dodge it, but I'm pretty sure the driver swerved too. But the car ended up clipping my mate's hip with the impact spinning him like a top right there in the road. The car screeches to a stop, and I hear the driver's door open, and then the sound of my mate groaning from the impact. I look up and see the driver walking toward me, and I'm already apologizing him, which strikes me in the most British thing ever. Now that I think about it, I got my phone out, and I'm literally plugging 999 onto the touchscreen. So when I see the driver with his phone out, I tell him like, "Nah man, I'm calling the ambo, don't worry about it." But he didn't get his phone out to call the paramedics, because the next thing I know, he's pointing his phone at me before the flash suddenly blinds me. He'd taken a picture of me. Then he did the same with Chris, angled his phone to get a good picture of his face too. And that's when I realized something was wrong. Well, more wrong than getting clipped by a car. Not only did the bloke take a picture of us, he didn't seem in the least bit concerned that he just hit one of us. He just took his photos and started looking around like he was lost or something. I later realized that he was probably just looking for witnesses or cameras, but at the time, he looked completely mental. And given that he wasn't helping us, I started to get angry. "Mate, what are you doing? Give us a hand here." I remember saying I wanted them to help move Chris out of the road, not knowing that's the opposite of what you're supposed to do. But instead of even trying to help, he pulls his hood up, turns around to us, and starts showing us the pictures he'd taken of us on his phone. Not a word to anyone about this. "We know what you look like, and we'll be coming for you if you talk." I remember thinking that he just didn't want to get into trouble. Maybe he was appointed to away from a driving ban, and to drunk lads walking in the middle of the roads weren't going to be the thing that took him down. Shocked when not surprised. People could be mega scummy when they want to be, but then something happened. I started realizing that the noise my mate was making sounded way more muffled than it should have been. And then in actuality, he hadn't been making any noise at all. He must have landed almost right on his chin because he was knocked out cold. So if it wasn't him that was making the noise, who was? And as the driver walked back to his car, that's when the penny dropped. The muffled groaning noise wasn't coming from my mate. They were coming from the boot of his fella's car. Before the horror of what was happened could really sink in, the wheels of the car screeched before it sped off the road. There were a few seconds where I think I was just in pure shock. It wasn't until I could hear the 999 operator talking on the phone that I came to and just hung up. I was too afraid, and I thought blokes only locked people in air boots doing cartoonish Guy Ritchie films. I didn't think it actually happened for real. And I'm incredibly claustrophobic to the idea of being locked in the booth. It's an actual living nightmare for me. I just stayed there, kneeling next to Chris until he suddenly came to. He had a few cuts and abrasions inside his mouth, which looked a bit scary because of all the blood. But it turned out that he'd be fine. He had some horrible bruising on his hips the next day, probably a concussion. But he was good to walk home, even if it was pretty painful. Thank God for the booze that keeps you lumber, and I don't think I'd have been able to get him home. Otherwise, he didn't remember what happened at all. I guess as a result of being killed and knocked that memory out real quick. But I promised to tell him when he was sober. The next day, I caught him as he was about to go to the local walk-in treatment center with his mom. It took some explaining, but once it made it very clear that some very, very bad things might happen to us if we reported that what happened was a hit and run. He started to relent. It didn't matter if we were in the middle of the road. The car had hit him and then bailed, which was something that the police would be very keen on investigating, and I needed him to admit those details. And if that was the case, some very bad man had actual pictures of us, stuff they could distribute if they really needed to. We'd never be safe. They could just put a price on our heads or something, and desperate enough for the cash would just take us out. That's how it is around here. And that's how Chris ended up insisting to his mom that what had happened to him was just when he got a little too sloshed and took a tumble down some steps. That's all they really need to know, and they will just go from there and treat him as need be. But a few days of mild pain were considerably preferable to what I was fearing of a permanent dirt nap. And so just like we were told, we kept our golf shots and kept our health. After all, I was worried that if we blabbed about what we'd seen, neither of us would be around to see my 21st. I probably don't have to tell you that kids aren't always the kindest of people. When you're growing up, you are learning wrong and right in real time. Kids often do and say things grown-ups would scoff at. Some things you could call cruel. And none of us reached adulthood without being guilty of these misdemeanors either, not even me. So many reach the end of the story and find me guilty of being one of the worst, and I'm willing to suffer that fate. I may even agree with you. After all, when I was 12, I helped kill a man. Once I reached the age of 14, I passed in the world of latchkey kid, a phenomenon I'm not even sure exists anymore. However, for a few years prior to that, I was forced to spend my time out of school at a local large-scale daycare center. I know my folks had no other choice at the time, but the experience was bristling, especially in the summers. I had been free to run unattended since birth. I still don't look back favorably on that time, and my feelings about being stuck in daycare is another story for another time. You're here to hear about my crime. Well, during summers, the daycare had to find a way to keep hundreds of kids, some almost as old as 16, busy. Since the center happened to be located near the downtown area, they used this to their advantage. Several attractions were within walking distance. The most often visited was my favorite was the city library. At least once a month, we'd been grouped together and marched the quarter of a mile or so to the place. On the walk there, the group would pass places like the old post office and several large churches. One of these churches had a spire that was easily 50 to 75 feet in the air. I'm not sure the exact height, but to the child's eyes, it might as well have been 1,000 feet. Someone had noticed a man working at the very top of the spire. I couldn't tell you what he was doing, but to us, he was a prime target for our harassment. I have no idea who said it first, but once the initial call for fall down was heard, most of the other boys joined in. It's not a thing I say with any pride, but that's what happened. The ghoulish chants went on for another few seconds until our monitor told us to shut up. Unfortunately, her demands came too late. No more had the yellow ceased than a snapping was heard. The snapping was quickly followed by the horrible sight of the following man. Everyone had seen it happen. Fortunately, his body landed on the opposite side of the building, and young eyes were prevented from seeing his ultimate demise. As you can guess, the incident caused quite a stir. Several of the girls began screaming, crying. I was in total shock from my part. The lady did all she could do and rushes back to the daycare. I don't recall much discussion upon our return. The girls were comforted, and us boys, we may have mumbled a bit about it to our friends, but no one seemed to want to relieve it. These days, I'm sure droves of psychologists and counselors would have been called in to make us talk about it incessantly. This was the 80s though. People dealt with trauma in much different ways. Whether you agree or not, that was the way things were around the center. The incident was quickly forgotten, although a kid would bring it up from time to time. Most of us, especially those who witnessed it, just wanted to forget. I still have no idea if my parents were notified about it. The last thing I wanted to do was bring it up to them. I like to act as if terrible things never happened, and it worked for me so far, and let's hope it continues to the poor man who died that day. I have no idea what unfolded afterwards. I assumed that he was some sort of construction worker looking back. Seeing that he was sort of on some type of scaffolding at the time, it was probably just doing some basic maintenance. The adults shielded us from any severe details beyond that, and I can't say I blame them. I tried to find as much information in the intervening years, but didn't find much, as probably for the best. I'm sure his loved ones don't want to remember him by his manner of death. This may be the first time I've actually mentioned it to anybody who wasn't there that day. And I'm sure you're wondering the same thing I am. Did our yelling actually cause that poor man's death? That question will never be answered. I remember the sound of a snapping rope, but that might have been a coping mechanism. It's probably our jeering that caused him to become distracted and led to his horrible fall, a mistake on the site. I like to think that he never even heard us, and circumstances were what they were. Does that remove that last bit of nagging doubt from my mind? I'll let you figure that last one out for yourself.